Hello and welcome to Aashrit Parvangada's Tipping Points, a podcast where I talk about historical tipping points that affect me and probably you personally. Welcome to the next episode of Dark and Deep, a season which delivers to you a unique and cohesive perspective on how oil powers our lives today in the way that it does. Lawrence of Arabia released in 1962. It was an epic biographical adventure drama based on the life of a real person, T.E. Lawrence, and his 1926 autobiography, 7 Pillars of Wisdom. In the book, he covers his adventures during the Arab Revolt, a British-supported Arab revolt against their Ottoman Turk masters that helps shape the way the Arab world looks today. The film was nominated for 10 Oscars, winning 7, including Best Picture and Best Director. It won many other awards too. It's widely regarded as one of the greatest films ever made. And in 1991, the U.S. Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. And while I read about Lawrence of Arabia, I was also curious. The film is a classic after all, and I watched it in the run-up to this episode. It is a fantastic character portrait, and I highly recommend everyone watching it, regardless of whether you're a history fan or not. It is just a fantastic movie. The movie revolves around the struggle of identity of T.E. Lawrence. That he's more than just a man. Or so the movie indicates. It begins with him lighting a fire against his thumb and not reacting to the pain. A couple of soldiers around him ask him, "How do you do that?" And they try it themselves. With a little lighter, they just light a fire on their thumb. And the soldier goes, "Oh, that hurts." And Lawrence goes, "Yes, it does." And the soldier goes, "So what's the trick then? How do you do it?" And Lawrence says, "Well, the thing about it is to not mind the pain." So the movie establishes that he is easily willing to put away the base needs and bodily signals of other men, pain, identity, even sexuality, the movie implies. And everything he chases in life is on a matter of principle, philosophy. There are some fantastic scenes in the movie, and I will sprinkle them throughout this episode. But about 30 minutes in, Lawrence was being guided through the desert by a Bedouin from a certain tribe, and they stop at a well of someone else's tribe to drink water. As they drink from the well, a warrior of the other tribe sees them drinking, rides towards them, and shoots the Bedouin. There's a nice scene here about how Lawrence identifies himself as a better man than this murderer. Something that, spoiler alert, the movie does turn the tables on later on. But Lawrence says, "None of my friends are murderers." Anyway, the Sharif Ali mostly just ignores him. He says, "They cannot drink from our wells." He knew that. Salam, and he rides away. But as he rides away, Lawrence shouts, "Sheriff Ali!" Sheriff being not like the American sheriff, but a sharif. So he says, "Sheriff Ali!" And the sheriff turns to listen to Lawrence. And Lawrence says, "So long as the Arabs fight, tribe against tribe, so long will they be a little people, a silly people, greedy, barbarous, and cruel as you are." And that establishes the setting of this movie. The Ottomans are ruling over the Arabs, and Lawrence has a deep respect for Arabia and Arabs and the religion of Islam, which the movie brings out in various ways. And Lawrence, it's indicated, sees himself as something like a prophet. He wants to unite the Arab peoples to their great destiny. But underneath it all is the real story of a man who fought with the Arabs against the Turks to win an independent Arab country. Indeed, as World War I ended, The British did defeat the Turks and will carve up their empire. The British had long been at work in laying the groundwork for a takeover in the Middle East, be it knowingly or not. And before we get to the oily aftermath of World War I and T.E. Lawrence himself, I would like to take a couple of episodes to cover how the field was set for Lawrence of Arabia's adventures. In specific, British interests in the Middle East. It's becoming easier to forget now, with the all-encompassing gaze of the Eye of Sauron that is the United States of America, that there was a time not long ago when the British were the guarantors of stability and protection across much of the world, especially in the Middle East. In this episode, we'll look at the fascinating way in which Brits and Arabians worked together to create the foundation of the Middle East as we know it today. Here we go. Now, the Ottoman rule of Arab lands is something of a mixed bag. I can't use a blanket statement on whether it was good or bad. It was relatively peaceful. It was relatively politically unified. It was relatively religiously unified. Quoting from an Al Jazeera opinion piece by Mustafa Minawi, he says, quote, "In places like Syria and Lebanon, probably the best-known Ottoman official is military commander Ahmed Cemal Pasha, Ahmed Jamal Pasha, infamously nicknamed Al-Safa, meaning the butcher. His wartime governorship of the provinces of Syria and Beirut was marked by political violence and executions of Arab Ottoman politicians and intellectuals, and remains in public memory as the symbol of Ottoman rule. But as historian Salim Tamari has pointed out, it is wrong to reduce 4 centuries of relative peace and dynamic activity during the Ottoman era to 4 miserable years of tyranny symbolized by the military dictatorship of Ahmed Jamal Pasha in Syria. Indeed, Ottoman imperial history in the Arab world cannot be boiled down to a Turkish occupation or a foreign yoke. We cannot grapple with this 400-year history from 1516 to 1917 without coming to terms with the fact that it was a homegrown form of imperial rule. A substantial number of the members of the imperial ruling class were in fact Arab Ottomans who hailed from the Arabic-speaking majority parts of the empire, like the Malhemes of Beirut and the Al-Azams of Damascus." End quote. Sorry, I'm probably butchering the names. I won't make a blanket statement on whether Ottoman rule was entirely peaceful or entirely some kind of oppression, because these things are more complex than that, and this episode is not about Ottoman rule in Arabia. This episode is about Pax Britannia in Arabia. The British peace, also known as Pax Britannica, was named after the Latin phrase Pax Romana, which referred to the Roman peace across the Mediterranean for hundreds of years. That term was coined by Seneca the Younger in 55 CE. The term Pax Britannica was first popularized in 1893 by Joseph Chamberlain. Joseph Chamberlain was father to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and also father to the Nobel Peace Prize winner Austen Chamberlain. He started out as a liberal but eventually became an imperialist who would state confidently, quote, "I believe that the British race is the greatest of the governing races that the world has ever seen. It is not enough to occupy great spaces of the world's surface unless you can make the best of them. It is the duty of a landlord to develop his estate." End quote. So Joseph Chamberlain referred to the Pax Britannica to refer to the era of peace that Britain brought to the world. I don't believe that he was initially talking about the entire world. Chamberlain intended the phrase to explain the pacifying effects of Britain's rule in India, though it eventually came to be understood as the broader phenomenon whereby the world was peaceful under Britain's rule, supposedly. But this episode is called Pax Britan-Arabica because, under Britain's rule, there really was a voluntary peace in certain parts of Arabia at least. So you could even say that before Britain reached the Middle East, much of it was under something like a Pax Ottomana. But the Middle East has been peaceful, relatively so, for vast stretches of human history. That is about to change by the end of Pax Britan-Arabica, and we'll see why. The Russians, British, and French would spend centuries starting from roughly the 1700s, eating into Ottoman territory from all sides, in competition with one another. When the French moved into Egypt, the British helped the Ottomans and defeated the French. When the Russians moved in, the British and French helped the Ottomans, like in the Crimean War, and defeat the Russians. By 1853, the Ottomans had suffered numerous military defeats, most recently from that date, a failed siege of Vienna in Austria, and Tsar Nicholas would refer to the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe. Their empire is now famous for that moniker because it was used also in the lead-up to World War I, but it's easy to forget in this context that the Ottoman Empire struck fear into the hearts of most Europeans for hundreds of years. After all, they were responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, some of these parts of the Ottoman Empire were semi-independent. You'd have a pasha running them, like in the case of Egypt. And these are the kinds of opportunities ripe for a new global power to move in. Britain had been at work in setting themselves up as the major power in the Middle East for quite some time. The main objective of all this was, of course, to maintain access and control of India, the most prized possession in the British Empire. India was a source of nearly unlimited resources in manpower, food, and other raw materials for the British Empire on a scale that it could not hope to achieve in any other part of the world. Not to mention that India became a wealthy captive market for British goods, where hundreds of millions of formerly prosperous people, on a relative scale of course, would be forced to buy cheaper quality British manufactured goods in order to develop British industry. George Curzon, the man who would eventually become Viceroy of India, said in 1901, quote, "As long as we rule India, we are the greatest power in the world. If we lose it, we shall drop straight away to a third-rate power." End quote. So India was the main focus when the British tried to secure control of West Asia, but there were multiple converging objectives as well. Towards the latter half of the 1800s, controlling Suez was an important goal in and of itself, India notwithstanding, though that was a big factor in that as well. The British had trade in goods from the rest of Asia too. Other Europeans thought the canal was crucial, so the British taking it over, as we covered in Canal of the Pharaohs, gave them an edge everywhere. It gave them a degree of leverage over the Ottoman Empire, which they had an interest in keeping alive to buffer the Russians, but wanted weak. But long before Suez, and with India in mind, the British had established treaties and bases in the Middle East. As early as 1650, before the colonization of India even began, British diplomats signed a treaty with the Sultan of Oman that the bond between the two nations should be, quote, unshook to the end of time, end quote. That's because Oman harbored one of the most advanced navies on the Arabian Peninsula, and for the British to maintain contacts with India, it helped to have an ally in Oman. After Napoleon's shock invasion of Egypt, and by that time India was a colony of the British Empire, most of it at least, the British needed the ability to project power into West Asia to maintain their control of India. You can't just have rival European powers waltzing into West Asia and using that as a base or staging ground for an invasion of India, which was Napoleon's objective. So the Crown upgraded the East India Company operations to include diplomacy. They could now, theoretically, sanction treaties, alliances, and make enemies of their own accord. At the very least, they would oversee all of that for British agents of the Crown. Let's remember that from 1757 to about 1857, India was controlled not by the Crown but by the privately owned East India Company. The British East India Company, in terms of share of global resources concerned, might be the most powerful company in history. Don't quote me on that, but I wouldn't be surprised. They probably directly or indirectly controlled 20% plus of global resources and people for 100 years. How's that, Google? Indeed, British India under the East India Company was a more formidable power than the Crown itself. At its peak, it would have 260,000 soldiers, double the number of the British Army. Most of these soldiers were Indian. And it was this powerful East India Company that would oversee Britain's foreign policy in the Middle East, until the First Indian War of Independence in 1857, which would end in a takeover of the East India Company by the British government. The British were originally only interested in Muscat, Oman as a naval base, hence their 1650 treaty. But in 1797, Arabs of the lower Gulf began piracy operations against British Indian ships. So the British launched a naval operation, or multiple naval operations, against those who they believed to be responsible. Some of the rulers of the Trucial States, which is what is today called the UAE. I find it funny to talk about the UAE in this context, as a pirate nation, because I was born there. And being a pirate nation is the last thing that one would think of the UAE today. A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this episode makes the UAE and the things that I saw there as a kid make much more sense to me. I'll get to those personal colorations in a bit and spill my guts out to you all. So following this piracy stuff, the British impose an anti-piracy treaty on the Trucial States, following which Bahrain would request to join the treaty as well. This would give the British the right to plant agents throughout these states, who acted as diplomats with a high degree of autonomy and power. Many of these staff would stay in these Gulf countries until the late 1900s. Let that sink in. The British agent in Dubai only left in 1971. My parents were alive then. I get the sense these agents were somewhat James Bond-esque. One Sir Rupert Hay, Gulf resident from 1941 to 1953, with some breaks in the middle, said, quote, "The close personal contact maintained between the political agents and the rulers is an outstanding feature of the British position in the Persian Gulf. They meet each other frequently, and more often socially than for official talks. Possibly the social meetings are more important than the official ones, as a hint dropped here and there in the course of a casual conversation is often more effective than formal advice. And the rulers, being Arabs, are quick to resent any attempt to teach them their business. Usually, the relations between a ruler and his political agent are, outwardly in any case, those of personal friends." End quote. There's a fantastic scene about 45 minutes into Lawrence of Arabia, where Prince Faisal I of Iraq at that time just Prince Faisal of the Hashemite tribe, who would go on to be king in Iraq. Prince Faisal is getting advice from his British military advisors as part of the British plan to create the Arab revolt against the Turks. The military advisors saying, "But you must retreat." Faisal, being a warrior from a warrior tribe himself, is arguing with him. He cannot take orders from a British man. There's something implied in the movie that he doesn't even like the tone with which this British man is telling him to retreat. Of course, for the British military advisor, it's much more of a strict military thing, right? He thinks of things like must do and must not do. We must retreat because their planes can get us from here. But there's a way to talk to the Arab kings, and the movie depicts this beautifully. Lawrence says, "If I may," and he takes a softer approach. He quotes from the Quran. He tells the king he's visited Damascus, and he says it was beautiful. This shows the king that Lawrence respects and understands the Arab way of life, to some small degree at least. And because of Lawrence softening him up, the king looks back to the other British military advisor, who is Lawrence's boss at that time, and Prince Faisal says, quote, "You tread heavily, but you speak the truth. I will give you my answer tomorrow, and now it is late." End quote. This is just a little bit of an illustration of how treading heavily and telling Arab rulers what to do is considered impolite. These are proud warriors, and if you were to revel with them about the beautiful things in the Quran, or talk about their homeland, or refer to the fruits that you both enjoy, that might be a better way to get your message across. So, a little bit James Bond-esque. Britain would take up protection of Oman in 1829, the Trucial States in 1835, Kuwait in 1899, and Qatar in 1916. You might be thinking, sure, protection. They probably just bullied everyone with gunboat diplomacy. There was no doubt some bullying at some points in time, but what I was surprised to find out is that often in the context of these kingdoms in the Middle East, the sheikhs or rulers welcomed the British. Why is that? Well, that's a fascinating story, and explains very much about the Arabian Peninsula even today. Much of what I'm about to say comes from a fantastic paper by James Onley, titled Britain and the Gulf Sheikdoms 1820 to 1971, The Politics of Protection. Quote, "To the outside observer at the time, and to most academics today, relations between the rulers appear volatile before the Pax Britannica. The only way rulers could safeguard their domains from attack was through their militaries. Competition for scarce resources had produced, as one British official put it, a condition wherein every man's hand was ever prone to be raised against his neighbor. This impression is deceptive, for there was a diplomatic system at work providing a degree of stability. When the British became aware of this system and adopted the code of conduct themselves, it became the foundation of the Pax Britannica. The rulers of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Trucial States, and occasionally Muscat, all lacked the means to defend their domains without outside help. If a ruler faced the impending attack of a stronger enemy, therefore, he had little choice but to seek the protection of a regional power, the Ottomans, the Persians, Saudis, Omanis, and Qawasim of Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah, to ward off the threat. These protectors gave guarantees of defense in return for subservience or the relinquishment of some degree of independence. The protégé's payment of tribute symbolized this and had a transforming effect. The protector regarded his tributary as a part of his own tribe. Similarly, the protector regarded his tributaries' territory as his territory, but with one important distinction. The protector considered such land, especially if it was at some distance from his sheikhdom, to be a dependency, rather than a part of his sheikhdom. The protector usually left the governing of his dependency to the local ruler or tribal leader who had submitted to his authority. End quote. This system of rules is also shown beautifully in Lawrence of Arabia. During the movie, Lawrence brings two tribes together, the Hashemites and another tribe. One day, there's a commotion and someone is dead. Someone from the Hashemite tribe had killed someone from the other tribe, and both the tribes line up on different sides of the battlefield ready to duke it out for a tribal blood feud. This goes back to what Lawrence was saying earlier, right? Where the Arabs, divided will be a small people, barbarous and cruel. So they're ready for a blood feud. But Lawrence wants to bring the Arabs together. According to the movie, he considers himself a bit of a prophet after all. And if the other tribe kills the Hashemite murderer, that won't fly, because that's part of the tribal blood feud. So Lawrence says, I'll do it. He says he'll execute the murderer. And that way nobody takes offense and justice is served. Turns out the murderer is something like Lawrence's friend and he has to kill him anyway. And he does it with something between sadness and great relish in his eyes. The movie struggles with the concept that he might be a psychopath of some kind. But after Lawrence executes this guy, both the tribes come together again and continue working together to defeat the Turks. So everything had to happen according to a strict code of rules and honor and tribal blood. As the British became the world's preeminent naval power, it only made sense to have them become the protectors of these usually coastal Arab kingdoms, like Kuwait or Oman or the Trucial states. And so they did. No doubt sometimes they abused that power. But remember, this was voluntary. The Gulf states requested British protection, mostly in the mid-1800s. And the British could have refused, but they accept, for three reasons. One was to protect shipping between Bombay, India's commercial port, and Basra in Iraq. Remember that this was before Suez, so the route from India to Britain was through the Gulf of Oman, past the Trucial states, the UAE, past Qatar and Kuwait, and to some degree Persia, and finally up the Shatt al-Arab River in Iraq towards Basra port, which sits a little bit up the river. From there, the goods were taken overland to Aleppo in Syria, and then shipped through the Mediterranean. If it sounds difficult, it's because it was a little bit difficult. Well, this was one route. The other one was around Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, which the British also control. So this is the first reason that the British accept, to protect the coastal Arab states, because it protects their own lines of shipping. And if you're an Arab state, that makes a lot of sense too, because you are a coastal state and the world's greatest naval empire is shipping their goods past your coast. Do you want them as a potential enemy? I think not. The second reason the British accept was to protect British trade with the states themselves. The Gulf states, that is. They traded some valuables like pearls, for example. Dubai used to be a fishing village where they dove for pearls and exported them as one of their major businesses. Interestingly, the first truce with the Trucial states was a 6-month experiment during pearling season, where the British would protect the Trucial states as they dove for pearls, right? A sensitive time. You're diving in the water, you want safety in the water. And after the 6 months, everyone liked the arrangement that they extended the truce. According to one account, Sheikh Sultan bin al-Qasimi, quote, not only expressed his earnest desire for a renewal of the truce, but added that it would afford him sincere pleasure if it could be changed into the establishment of a permanent peace upon the seas. End quote. So to reiterate, the Gulf states requested British protection, as they do request American protection even today. The US patrols the Straits of Hormuz and the Gulf, and countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar and Kuwait love it. Some of these countries even have American troops on their soil. So some things are just geographic. It's not because it's the US, just as it wasn't because it was the British, just because it wasn't because it was the Ottomans. It's just that some places' geography lends to them doing certain things, no matter the time period. The third reason the British accept was to protect British subjects in the Middle East. Europeans were living and trading in many of these Middle Eastern countries, and having your navy close by is always something that just lets all the locals know not to try anything weird. In today's world, American citizens receive a similar degree of protection. America will go to any lengths to get its citizens out of trouble in any part of the world. You're in the deepest mountain in Afghanistan being held hostage? That's no problem. So there are some things that a superpower with a global military presence can do. On accepting the role, the British would need to maintain a navy to patrol the waters of the Gulf, which they did. My guess is that in the future, so it was the British, today it's the Americans. My guess is that simply due to geography, in another 25 years it will be India, and it might stay that way for a long time. We'll get to the USA's part of the story in the Middle East eventually. With all these treaties in effect, we get the Pax Britannia-Arabia, what I want to call here the Pax Britan-Arabica. Before we wrap up the episode, it's worth talking about a number of butterfly effects that come out of British protection of the Gulf states. It's hard to understate how much the British shaped the region. According to one paper, the Gulf states become more autocratic and dictatorial. Once the British recognize one family as the sheikh of the region, that family can more or less do whatever they want within that region with much less fear of repercussion. They had never before that had that kind of protection. The British Navy was a different beast from everything that came before it. Using British protection, many of these states go ahead unifying their internal territories and tribes under these families, resulting to some extent in the Arab countries that we know of today. For example, in 1915, during the First World War, Ibn Saud, the ruler of the House of Saud that rules Saudi Arabia today, signed the Treaty of Darien with the British government, making him a British protectorate. Saudi Arabia wasn't a country yet in 1915. It was just a family that received British support to do something like an uprising, you could call it. The House of Saud went on to destroy the Al-Rashid clan and the Sharifs of Mecca, and the Ottoman Turks in Hassa, though for a while he acknowledged the Ottomans and took the title of Pasha, which is something like a minister for the Ottoman Empire but localized. Eventually he took the British alliance and fought against the Ottoman-backed Al-Rashid clan. In 1921, Ibn Saud defeated the Rashidis and united most of Arabia under his rule, in one of the most autocratic regimes on earth. So even this happened largely thanks to British support. If you look at Saudi Arabia today, just know that some part of its story for why it exists is because it received British support. The British played a significant role in establishing the infrastructure of statehood too. All post offices in the Gulf were run by the Indian Postal Service from 1860, or sometime in the 1860s, to 1947, until India's independence. and then by the Royal Mail for decades after that as well. So many of the things that allow these states, right? So the states themselves were supported by the British, but once they were created, what allows a state to run is efficient infrastructure. And much of the infrastructure that allows these states to run was also established by the British. Now, if you're thinking that it was exploitative in nature and I'm just being a pro-colonial by saying that yes, the British established infrastructure, you wouldn't be entirely wrong, and believe me, I hate that I'm giving the British credit for building infrastructure in Arabia, because often I'll get the argument that they built infrastructure in India, but the infrastructure that was built in India was built primarily for the purpose of extracting resources from the Indian heartland to the coast, from where it could be shipped to the United Kingdom. And so I don't give the British credit for establishing the infrastructure in India. Well, some minor credit, but no brownie points, you could say. But in Arabia, it was a different deal, right? In the 1860s, it's not like Arabia had valuable resources like oil yet, and nothing even close to the scale that India was operating. So the British really did establish a postal service, maybe just so that they could keep in touch with their agents better and keep tabs on what's going on in these countries, but still, credit where credit is due. But it isn't all sunshine and rainbows. On the downside, the Pax Britannica removed a level of autonomy and control of the sheikhs within their own countries, because the agent was the real source of power. There's a fantastic scene in Lawrence of Arabia where Lawrence is caught by Prince Faisal, getting ready to ride out with a bunch of his warriors to take the Turkish port town of Aqaba. The prince says, okay, go ahead then, but you're going on something like a suicide mission. And Lawrence says, we ride for Prince Faisal then. And Prince Faisal says, and whose name do you ride in? And Lawrence rides away. In the early 1900s, it would be the British that developed the oil infrastructure that makes the Middle East what it is today. Or at least the British were a major player. And this is going to become more important as the region discovers oil, and we begin seeing the unequal oil treaties of the 1900s. That's what we'll jump into in our next episode. As a bit of a postscript before I wrap up this episode, I also want to share some personal stories. I grew up in the UAE for the first 12 years of my life. The UAE being the Trucial States, which were covered extensively in this episode. And growing up, I always noticed that Europeans at large, but specifically Brits, received a degree of prestige in the United Arab Emirates that I struggled to get my head around for many years, as a kid especially. It could come across in subtle ways, like if you're at a restaurant and there are British people there, you'd notice visibly that they might have received a level of service that was better than what I as an Indian received, or even what people from other countries around might receive either. It was hard to miss. There were things that were not so subtle, that companies would regularly look for British CEOs or managing directors. Qualifications played a bit of a part, but if it came down to someone with, let's say, 10% less qualifications, but they were British, these companies would often hire Brits, and it's something that I heard the adults around me talking about quite frequently. And it also gave me the impression as a kid that British people in the UAE received a degree of prestige that other people didn't get. Advertisements often featured British people. Simply put, almost everywhere that I looked around in the society of the UAE, there was always a slightly special place for British people. Right? Dubai works on something of a hierarchy. I don't know if it's still the same. I haven't been in a long time. The last time I went, I was 16 to visit some family. But there's a hierarchy in Dubai. There's the locals, the Emiratis, who make up something like 15% of the population. And they're, of course, more or less kings. They don't have to follow the rules. If you get into an accident with one, you're at fault no matter what happened, even if they were really at fault. They are essentially the rulers of the country. Maybe they are punished or corrected for that within their own families with a tap of the hand or something, right? A smack on their hand. But in the public domain, in public society, you'd notice that they can do whatever they want, and there was an element of fear, right? Let them do whatever they want. If they insult you, just take it like a man. This was advice, very real advice I got from many of the adults around me, by the way. There was a second class of society that was Europeans or people of European descent. White people, more generally, you could say. I'm not trying to get into race politics here, but I'm just realistically describing to you what anyone who grew up in Dubai in the early 2000s would describe to you as well. And maybe even today, again, I don't know, haven't been back in a while, but I can tell you it was a very real thing back then. But within this second class of Europeans, British people were clearly at the top, right? And maybe Swiss people, there were divisions even within that class, is what I'm saying. Then there was the third class of society, which were Arabs from different parts of the Middle East that are maybe not so well off, the Egyptians, Jordanians, Palestinians, perhaps Saudis, Iranians. There were many Iranians in Dubai. And then finally, towards the bottom, were Indians, Africans, Chinese, essentially the colonized peoples of the world. And that was something very real that all of us felt every day, either in subtle ways or in very real ways, very overt ways, overt aggression, right? Even happens at the kid level. You'd get an Arab kid run up to you and say, "Oh, you filthy Indian, get out of my country." Like, stuff like that was fairly common. I'm not saying this to receive any sympathy. I grew from those experiences. I think they were good, and I wouldn't trade them away even if I could. I just mean to illustrate in the context of this episode that very real experiences of people in these parts of the world today, the Trucial States, Saudi Arabia, were shaped in a meaningful way by the Pax Britannia that happened in the 1800s and 1900s. And that's why we're here. That's why we're at Aashrit Pravangada's Tipping Points, where we can illustrate some of these experiences and try to color our world a little bit with the context that they bring. Alright, so that's me spilling my guts out to you, but I love it. I hope we get to do it in the future. And I hope you found Pax Britan-Arabica interesting. This is Aashrit Pravangada's Tipping Points, and see you next time. And as Britain becomes more bogged down in the Middle East, it ends up affecting both the Middle East's destiny and Britain's destiny, and the West's destiny and the world's destiny forever. We'll continue the journey into the Middle East in the next episode.